This is part 2 of the Heeresgeschichtliches Museum, or the Museum of Military History in Vienna, Austria. And this is the most significant artifact in the museum. The automobile that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were assassinated in. The event that precipitated World War I. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand turned out to be the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. His long-serving uncle Kaiser Franz Josef was 83 at the time, so he must have known his time was coming soon. An avid traveler, the Archduke decided to take a trip to Bosnia-Herzegovina in June of 1914. The region had been annexed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1908, a move that was strongly opposed by Serbia because there was a significant Serb population there. Some young Bosnians who were ethnic Serbs desired to be part of a greater Serbia through whatever means necessary, so when some young nationalists heard of the Archduke's visits, members of the Black Hand went to Belgrade to get a hold of some weapons, including semi-automatic pistols, hand grenades, and cyanide capsules for an attempt to assassinate the Archduke. On June 23rd, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie departed for Sarajevo, despite warnings of potential attacks. On the fateful day of June 28th, they used this car in a publicly published motorcade route through the city. One of the would-be assassins hurled a hand grenade at the car, but it ricocheted off the car hood and rolled underneath the vehicle behind them. The explosion injured 2 army officers. The young Bosnian who threw the bomb got apprehended, but the others involved in the plot just walked off disappointed by their failure. Despite the attempt on his life, the Archduke went to his planned events, and after that he wanted to visit the injured officers at the hospital. So the motorcade passed through the city again at a faster speed, but by mistake some of the cars, including this one, turned onto the wrong street where one of the conspirators happened to be walking. The dejected 19-year-old prince saw the Archduke's car by chance pull up next to him, so he took a shot at nearly point-blank range. The assassin pulled out his pistol and fired twice at the couple, who were sitting in these very seats. The first bullet hit the Archduke in the jugular, while the second bullet pierced Sophie's abdomen. The Duchess slumped over unconscious and died almost immediately in this car, while the Archduke died soon after that. This assassination spiraled the perhaps inevitable events that would launch World War I, as Austria-Hungary, with Germany's approval, sent Serbia an unrealistic ultimatum after the assassination. By design they couldn't agree to all of it, so Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia exactly 1 month after the Archduke's death. Here are the relics of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, including the cavalry general uniform he was wearing when he was assassinated. You can see a bullet hole just below his neck, along with serious blood stains. The bloodied uniform is displayed above the sofa that Franz Ferdinand died on. After the shooting, the car rushed to the governor's residence in Sarajevo. Sophie had passed by that point, but the Archduke was rushed in, and he took his last breath on this sofa just 10 minutes after the shooting. It is a tragic circumstance, as while the Archduke had some personal prejudices, he probably would have been more respectful of Serbian and even Bosnian sovereignty as Kaiser. Also, there's the Archduke's fancy bicorn hats. And there's the Archduke's chapka, epaulets, and shoulder marks. Here are some relics of Duchess Sophie von Hohenberg. The assassin did say that he did not mean to hit Sophie. That rose and lace cloth was carried by Sophie during the assassination. It is stained with her blood. She was a bit controversial as she was not from a dynastic family, so they were able to marry on the condition that their descendants could not ascend to the Habsburg throne. That is a part of the windscreen from the 5th car in the Archduke's convoy, the one that was damaged in the first failed bomb attack, along with one of the grenades found at the site. Several of the semi-automatic pistols that were on the assassins are here. They were all the same model and they do not point out which one was used to kill the Archduke and Sophie, though that one may not be currently on display. With the violent murder of their heir, Austria-Hungary made the first of many war declarations, inciting a war that would prove to have stakes way beyond their issues in the Balkans. This Great War exhibit will be really interesting, as it is more so focused on the Eastern and Italian fronts. All the World War I exhibits I've seen have always been Western front centric. Also, I think it's fair to say that Austria-Hungary performed quite poorly in the Great War, so we'll see how that's presented. Here are some Serbian artifacts. The small army was severely underestimated and they put up a hell of a fight from 1914 to 1915, severely delaying Austria-Hungary and therefore Germany's ability to fight Russia. This is an armored cupola from Fort Kessel at Antwerp, Belgium. On October 4th, 1914, the Germans bombarded Fort Kessel, which they successfully destroyed by using artillery while outside the reach of Belgian guns. This cupola was struck by a direct grenade hit. You can see the impact right there. And the poor man inside was most definitely killed. The Austrians invaded Montenegro, a Serbian ally, in January of 1916. Here are various artifacts from the Eastern Front. Many of these are Russian pieces. The Russian Empire got involved to defend its ally Serbia. Much to the dismay of Germany, Russia mobilized their army incredibly quickly, so the hope of taking France before fighting Russia was ruined. The Germans had to fight on two fronts until 1917. This is titled After the Battle, a painting that symbolizes the end of the old Imperial Army of Austria, as they experienced heavy casualties and setbacks in an underestimated new type of warfare. That is a damaged fortress dome from Przemyśl, which was the largest stronghold in the Habsburg territory known as the Gate to Hungary. The Russians surrounded it and for 133 days bombarded the fort until March of 1915, when it was evacuated due to lack of provisions. The Russians blew the fort up and took 110,000 men prisoner. These are uniforms from voluntary units. Legions were formed in the Austro-Hungarian army, like the Autonomous Polish League, which had their own objective of re-establishing a Polish state. The Russians' Brusilov offensive in June of 1916, targeted against weak imperial and royal units, caused thousands of casualties, but they were only repulsed with the help of German and Ottoman forces. Despite that, Bukovina and East Galicia were lost yet again, and Romania joined the war with the Allied powers. They were not able to hold out long and dropped out of the war in 1917 after Russia's withdrawal. That is an Albatros B-2 biplane prototype. These were the most widespread reconnaissance and training planes of the Imperial Army. 5,200 of these were produced for the Austro-Hungarian Army and Navy. And here are some aerial bombs from the Great War, which introduced air combat and air bombings. That is a sound locator, used for locating approaching aircraft. This new technology was developed by the end of the war in 1918. This is really interesting. Due to lack of supplies, the Austrians often had to improvise, so they put this anti-aircraft gun on a trolley wheel. The war became an Alpine affair when previously neutral Italy joined the war in May of 1915 on the side of the Allies, so many soldiers who were not familiar with mountainous terrain ended up being sent to fight in the peculiar environment. The Eastern Front did not see the same type of trench warfare that was developed on the Western Front by 1916, but some of the most terrible trenches were endured on the Italian front. That is a portable protective shield on a roller that was used by the Austro-Hungarian infantry in the trenches. Here are some more artifacts from the trenches, including some trench art. There is a barbed wire souvenir. There are some Italian helmets, and even a flamethrower. Also, that armor and mask is very unique. That was designed to defend against chlorine gas, but it didn't work too well, as exposure would still cause the man wearing the mask to throw up in it, so they may take it off and then breathe in the gas. Of course, there were staggering casualties on all fronts. There's an authentic field stretcher. That is a huge siege howitzer from 1916. The howitzer would have to be disassembled into 4 parts and transported on train cars. Then they required 8 to 10 hours to assemble. Here is a great collection of artillery. At the start of the war, Austria-Hungary had inferior artillery in both quantity and quality. There is a siege mortar, which would be used on the main fronts. This type was also used by an imperial unit at Gallipoli fighting alongside the Ottomans, which is hard to imagine given their history. Here are uniforms from foreign fronts beyond the Balkans. Only towards the end of the war did any provisions of the Austro-Hungarian army fight in the Western Front. Emperor Franz Josef passed away on November 21st, 1916, right in the middle of the war. The successor was his grandnephew Karl I. He made some reforms given the situation. By December he assumed supreme command of the Imperial and Royal Army, and reappointed many leaders. His reign did not last long, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed by 1918, and Karl I himself was exiled, then eventually abdicated as the last Habsburg sovereign. That's an M1894 casemate cannon. These would be used at mountain fortresses as defense against infantry attacks. That gun has the unique distinction of being the highest position cannon in Europe during the Great War, as it was stationed at 3,950 meters, nearly 13,000 feet. Here's a closer look at the Albatros B type. That photo shows how aviators would just drop the bombs from biplanes by hand. There's an early aviator's jacket, and a machine gun that was mounted on a box from a plane. Those are steel flechettes. They would be dropped from the air, and would gain enough kinetic energy to kill anyone below them. That is a crossbow to launch hand grenades. This was an experiment that was never implemented, but hypothetically it could have been effective on the battlefield with its expanded range. We can take another look at the gargantuan field howitzer from the upper level. The Imperial and Royal Army only had 10 of these howitzers, but they were found to be incredibly effective in the South Tyrol offensive and the Battle of Asiago, which relied heavily on artillery. South Tyrol would become a part of Italy in 1919, as it still is today. 18-year-old Ernest Hemingway was serving as an ambulance driver for Italian troops on the front in 1918, when he was struck and severely injured by an Austrian mortar shell. Here are artifacts of Russian prisoners of war, during which over 2 million Russians were taken prisoner. Here are some examples of propaganda that was spread throughout the empire by the War Welfare Department. At the start of the war, citizens donated tons of money to the cause, but that grassroots financial support would diminish immensely in time. There is a mini Teutonic Knight, a wooden sculpture that was covered in nails as Austrian citizens donated to the war cause. There is a huge iron soldier with a similar story on display at the Rathaus here in Vienna. This painting is titled To the Nameless. A veteran recorded his experience on the Italian front as the individual soldiers lost their identity in the mass army. The famed expressivist artist Egon Schiele got conscripted in 1915. Though he continued his art and exhibiting, he created this sketch of 2nd Lieutenant Heinrich Wagner in 1917. This museum has a massive collection of his wartime illustrations, though sadly they don't display them. This is a haunting painting from the war, The Soldier and Death. The Great War ended the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburg dynasty. Austria as a state became significantly condensed, largely to their German-speaking regions, most of present-day Austria. New national boundaries and states were created out of the empire, including Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. That is a certificate of authorization for armistice negotiations with Italy, as well as a peace treaty with Ukraine signed by Karl I. There's an interesting French steel helmet. World War I produced some interesting headwear. There were thousands of soldiers coming home with terrible injuries after the war. There are some orthopedic braces. There's a wheelchair and prosthetic leg. About 1,200,000 people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were killed during the Great War. Here are some war relics that were excavated in the Dolomites from the brutal Italian fronts. These are some original field memorials, including one to an aviator who crashed during an attack on an Italian balloon. They made the crucifix a propeller. So that was a fascinating World War I exhibit. Totally different from any I have ever seen before. I definitely learned a lot, and of course the Franz Ferdinand assassination car was amazing to see. Now that's an artifact that changed the world. Continue the tour through this museum with the Republic and Dictatorship exhibit in part 3. That video is linked in the description. In addition to that, I have hundreds of videos featuring museums, historic locations, and much more across Europe and America. Also, I would appreciate it if you could like this video, share it, and subscribe to my channel for more. Thanks for watching!